Today's show is sponsored by Panoptica. Panoptica, Cisco's cloud application security solution, provides end-to-end lifecycle protection for cloud-native application environments. Panoptica empowers organizations to safeguard their APIs, serverless functions, containers, and Kubernetes environments. Panoptica ensures comprehensive cloud security, compliance, monitoring at scale, offering deep visibility, contextual risk assessments, and actionable remediation insights for all your cloud assets. To get more information, go to Panoptica's website, panoptica.app. That's Panoptica's website, panoptica.app.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. December of 2023 is upon us. Last month of the year. Hard to believe the year's gone by so fast. Hope everybody's doing well. I know you're probably planning for some sort of end of year thing, whether it's end of year with friends and family, end of year holidays, end of year religious activities, or just sort of end of year. You just want to be done with 2024. So a couple more shows for us left this year. We've got a couple of great guest interviews coming up. We've also got kind of all of the things that we do for end of the year. We will do a recap of reInvent. We'll do a recap of sort of the giant mailbag of a whole bunch of questions that you guys have asked throughout the year. We'll do our prediction show. We'll do a year-end show. We've got a couple of others that are planned for the year. So a lot of great stuff coming up before the end of the year. But I want to get to this third of three that we've been doing as far as recaps of kind of the periods of cloud computing, the phases of cloud computing, if you will. So we did one a couple of weeks ago that was the kind of pre-internet bubble, pre-dot-com bubble. So, 1993, 94 till 2001 when the dot-com bubble happened. A week ago, we did the kind of dot-com bubble to housing crash bubble. So roughly 2001 to 2008 or 9-ish. And we're going to wrap this up, and kind of this one is going to cover a longer period of time. We're not going to try and make the show a whole lot longer. There's a lot to cover, but we're going to basically cover from housing crash bubble, so 2008, 2009, all the way through the COVID-19 pandemic that went on. So those have really kind of been the three big phases, if you will, of cloud computing so far. We could go back to the internet ages, but those are kind of the three. And we want to kind of hit on this. And for those of you that are listening, the reason we do this is not just because we feel like going and doing a bunch of research. We find that it's often interesting to, have things like this to go back to, because it reminds you of a number of things. Number one, it reminds you, kind of how far you can get in a decade, but what feels, there's kind of an old saying, you never think you can get as far as you can in a year, and you always underestimate how far you can get in 3 or 4 or 5 years or 10 years. I think Bill Gates made a sort of a famous statement along those lines, but it allows us to kind of do a couple of things. Number one, it puts some perspective around how far we've come in a given decade or so. It gives us a sense of what drove certain things to happen, whether they were economic things to happen, new business models getting created, new technologies emerging, kind of what were the things that were driving that, because oftentimes technology doesn't necessarily always repeat itself, but history around technology does have a tendency to rhyme, if you will, meaning a lot of the things that we see are things that we've seen previously. So, it's always good for us to go back and figure out when did that first start happening? When did that pattern start to repeat and so forth? So that's kind of what we're doing with these three segments. Again, we'll put the links in the show notes in case you missed the earlier ones. So we are post housing bubble crisis. So internet first takes off. Everybody, buys into it through the stock market. Stock market crashes. Everybody kind of gives up on technology. Second phase of it, people start putting their money into housing. Technology sort of takes a back seat, but a number of trends that will be long-term trends, or at least midterm trends, start to emerge. Social media starts to emerge. We start to get sort of sharing economy, those types of things. And then, housing bubble crashes. Once again, people are sort of in a bind. Economically, people are in a bind. But after that, a couple of things happen. So first and foremost, interest rates, because we've now been through yet another crash, and this one being a significant financial crash that had all sorts of leverage all over the place. I mean, people were talking about this being just a complete doomsday for the economy. Governments around the world step in and essentially are giving away free money in all sorts of ways. Interest rates are zero, and they literally stay near zero, or basically federal government funding rates stayed near zero for almost a whole decade. They blip a little bit in 2018, then they go back to zero once the pandemic kicks in again. So we have basically a decade of free money, if you will, and this fuels all sorts of good things and bad things and sort of crazy things. So as we always do with these, we will dive into a perspective on what happened. We'll dive into kind of what happened from an open source perspective, from a cloud computing perspective, from a mobile perspective, and kind of an overall perspective on what happened with technology and the markets and the economy throughout this last sort of period up into the pandemic. We're not going to kind of relitigate what happened with the pandemic. You all have been living through this, but we'll get through kind of that 2001 phase, and we'll kind of wrap these up. So with that, I'll wrap it up and we'll dive into this after the break. Today's episode of the Cloudcast is sponsored by Datadog. Bring speed and scale to your security organization. Datadog Cloud Security Platform delivers real-time threat detection and continuous configuration audits across applications, hosts, containers, and cloud infrastructure. Built on top of the observability platform, Datadog brings unprecedented integration between security and DevOps aligned to shared organizational goals. As a listener to the Cloudcast, you can sign up for a free 2-week trial to see for yourself how Datadog can elevate your cloud infrastructure security posture by visiting datadog.com/security-cloudcast. Sign up now and receive a free Datadog t-shirt. That's datadog.com/security-cloudcast. Are you getting pressure from finance to justify or reduce your cloud bill? CloudZero is the only cloud cost platform loved by engineers and trusted by finance. CloudZero can identify unused, idle, or over-provisioned resources, alert you to spend anomalies, and organize 100% of your spend into a framework that mirrors your business structure, like cost per customer, product feature, or team. It's the most powerful platform ever built to provide accurate, granular visibility into your total cloud spend without the typical pitfalls of legacy cloud cost management tools like endless tagging or clunky Kubernetes support. Manage cost, optimize development, and maximize profit, all in one platform. Join companies like Rapid7, Drift, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. Visit today to experience immediate and ongoing savings on your cloud bill. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dive into roughly the period of computing that most of you are pretty familiar with, cloud computing that you're familiar with, kind of roughly 2009, 2010, housing bubble crisis, global sort of financial crisis, all the way through the COVID pandemic, and give or take a year or so within there. So let's kind of dive right into it, because there's a lot of things to cover, a lot of things to sort of map out in terms of how did we get from there to here. So quick recap, 2008 sort of happens, 2009 happens. Where were we technology-wise? Well, the iPhone had just barely come out, and the App Store had just barely come out. So, the idea of this 24/7 computing device in your pocket was becoming a global phenomenon, and that would have long-range impacts. 2007, AWS launches, or 2006, I think really 2007 it launches. And we start to have the concept of sort of shadow IT, the idea of on-demand computing, all those sort of things are just beginning to bubble up. And then we've got, like we mentioned, sort of social media and the sharing economy, this sort of, viewing the world with other people is beginning to happen. So all those phenomena are starting to happen, but we also have this economic crisis. So from an IT perspective, companies are very much looking at cutting budgets, slashing budgets, trying to find any way possible to save money, looking for alternatives to big contracts that they were in, long-term contracts, technology lock-in they might not be able to get out of. So again, every time that these sort of crises happen, people sort of rethink how do we get ourselves into these situations? How do we potentially get ourselves out of them? And at least in the near term, how do we find some economic way to, continue to survive, but do it maybe in a more efficient way, right? So just a couple of things that were going on around this time. And again, I'll hit on a bunch of different segments of the market and so forth. So we had sort of the idea of the sharing economy began. And these were basically companies that were saying, and we've joked, how can we deliver things? How can we do things using apps on your mobile phone that your parents essentially used to do for you? So Uber launches in 2009. Lyft, the competitor to it, launches in 2012. HelloFresh, deliver food for us. Uber, give us a ride somewhere. HelloFresh, bring me a meal. DoorDash, bring me a meal. Those both started around 2011, 2013. So a whole bunch of applications began that allowed us to do a couple of things. One, the idea of sort of direct to consumer became very popular. We want to just have a direct relationship with our consumers. The front door of our business is going to be the app on the mobile phone. We are going to take advantage of the fact that we have people that are willing to drive their car, pick up food, do all sorts of things, and be in connection with you just simply via your mobile phone, some text messages and things like that. So this phenomenon starting to happen. Again, sort of anywhere between 2009 through about 2010, 11, 12, 13, right? So that early part of the decade, people are beginning to figure out like, what are some interesting new business implications of having 24/7 computing and having, this new way of engaging people that aren't necessarily your employees, but are sort of employees of your business, to allow you to start to do some things at different scale than you would have ever had to do before if you had to buy trucks, buy vans, have remote restaurants all over the place. All sorts of those things were happening. A couple other things happening around that time. Netflix, which kind of got started pre-crash, 2007, became kind of a big phenomenon. Streaming became a new thing. So at that point, we had enough bandwidth to be able to do streaming to your television, to your computer. By 2010, Netflix has sort of taken off. And by 2010, it's into international markets. Now, to put this into perspective, as much as everybody was loving Netflix kind of became part of the fabric of the early 2010s, mid 2010s. It became part of the FANG dynasty, if you will. Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, FANG. So it was part of that sort of club of the fastest growing technology companies. Again, started in 2007. Disney, probably the most popular entertainment business, didn't start their streaming business for a decade. 2017, HBO didn't start their streaming until 2018. So we'll come back to this theme of you start something brand new that is disruptive to a business model. How long does it take companies that are the biggest at the time in a different way of delivering things to respond? Okay. GitHub launches in 2008, what at the time it seemed like, okay, people are kind of familiar with this thing called Git, this Linux sort of source code repository thing. It wasn't necessarily really new, but it was different. It was distributed, but all of a sudden it was a SaaS service. And it was like, hey, developers, you can put software out here. And this created a phenomenon, kind of the social media of developers, if you will. So developers could start to not only place their code out there, but start to have visibility of other projects that they could borrow from. There were publicly available things, open source sharing, all that kind of stuff. So GitHub starts in 2008. Social media world had gone through Twitter and Facebook and MySpace, but there was a whole new set of kind of micro social media things that were driven sort of explicitly around the phone. So Instagram starts in 2010, gets acquired by Facebook by 2012 when they only have like a dozen or so employees. Snapchat starts in 2011. And then, as everybody's kids are familiar now, TikTok starts 5 years later in 2016. So a whole new trend of things that are explicitly social media, but explicitly almost entirely designed around the phone, around cameras, around, kind of new behavior for teens, millennials, those types of things happening. Bitcoin launches in 2009. Now, I'd have to go back and look at what all the reasoning was for Bitcoin. It was, digital currency, don't be connected to the government, have an asset that you can be protected. The fiat currencies have terrible, inflation and they bounce up and down and all sorts of things. So Bitcoin launches in 2009. It's 9 cents basically for a Bitcoin. Now a Bitcoin is $38,000. So that inflation story doesn't really pan out. But also blockchain got announced in 2009. So it was going to be the database that was going to take over the world as the new way that we were going to do all commerce, all supply chain, all those sort of things. And it's, still evolving, but really hasn't necessarily panned out. Big news in 2011, the Cloudcast launches. By 2020, everybody has a podcast. Every person has multiple hot podcasts. So we got started kind of early. In the enterprise IT side of things, by 2008, Gartner had been looking at this trend that was going on, which was people building kind of these newer-ish kind of applications. Cloud was just starting to be a thing. And they came out with this thing called bimodal maturity model, or bimodal IT. And in essence, Gartner just made a basic comment that said, look, the way that you do traditional IT today, your typical long deployment processes, your typical 3-tier model for applications, front end, middleware, and database, kind of your legacy way of doing, reviews of code and all that kind of stuff. That stuff is going to be completely almost incompatible with this new way of doing stuff. And they sort of said you're going to have your olds and your slows, and you're going to have your news and your fasts. And people pan that like crazy. Oh my gosh, Gartner doesn't know what they're talking about. I think that's sort of panned itself out. And of all the things that Gartner has done, that one has sort of held the test of time, even though people have tried to force new ways on old ways and stuff like that. A couple other things. By 2008, VMware, who was one of the biggest names in IT at the time, they weren't Microsoft, they weren't Oracle, but essentially they were becoming the evolution of the core of IT, and they supercharged themselves between about 2008 and about 2012 because you had the economic, they had the economic crash, the financial crash, and every company was looking for ways to save money in IT, and VMware was the perfect technology for that. Virtualization basically had the easiest business case in the world. Deploy our software, you will save money, period. So Paul Maritz takes over. Paul Maritz, Microsoft executive, he'd been about number 3 at Microsoft, takes over at VMware in 2008 from Diane Green, who had previously sort of founded the company and started the company. By 2012, Paul Maritz had moved over to Pivotal, and Pat Gelsinger had come over from Intel. He had been floating around at EMC for a year or so, but he took over VMware. So interesting to sort of watch VMware kind of grow up from this startup, this sort of interesting company, got acquired by EMC, took off because the economics of IT collapsed in 2008, 2009. And they went through kind of a hyper growth period, but also trying to reinvent themselves period. Are we just virtualization? Are we bigger than virtualization? Do we need to get into applications? They did things like acquired Spring, the Java framework. And then by 2012 or so, all those decisions had sort of been wiped away. They had been moved or gotten rid of. Paul Maritz had gone off to this new sort of application-centric thing called Pivotal. We'll dig into that in a second. And then Pat Gelsinger had kind of come in and was trying to get them back to their roots of really infrastructure, virtualization, taking on more and more IT functions. Pat had come from Intel, had a huge background in sort of that space, if you will. By 2010, kind of an interesting phenomenon happened. So up until then, most things, we talked in previous shows that, open source had kind of been a thing before this, but not a major thing, not something that was an everyday mainstream thing other than Linux. And, by this time, Linux had proliferated, but still wasn't bigger than Windows, wasn't bigger than Unix necessarily at the time. But we begin in 2010 to start to see other parts of the technology stack start to have open source kind of applied to them, right? So we'd sort of seen Linux and we'd sort of seen databases, but this thing comes out in 2010 called OpenStack, and we've done some shows about OpenStack. We'll put some links in the show notes. It comes along and it tries to disrupt kind of cloud computing. It says, hey, there are 2 choices people have. There is VMware, proprietary and on-premises, and there is AWS, proprietary and in the cloud, and you're sort of locked into the cloud. And OpenStack came along, kind of weird, unusual beginnings. It got started by sort of an alternative cloud provider in Rackspace and the guys from NASA, which is sort of weird, essentially like an IT organization. And they said, hey, we want to build an open source cloud, if you will. And interesting, kind of turbocharged the industry for just a bit, because all of a sudden it was like, ooh, maybe there is an alternative to this duopoly of VMware and AWS. Now, the problem they ultimately had, as we talked about in shows, they couldn't figure out which side of that duopoly they really wanted to go after. They tried to go after both. And the interesting thing is they didn't necessarily disrupt either one of them, but they did find eventually a niche in the telco space, sort of, the next generation of what telco infrastructure looks like. So OpenStack went through a hype period went through a crash period, if you will, sort of, people stopped believing in this idea of open source infrastructure. And then it eventually sort of found a home in telco and still, has a pretty robust home over there. So still exists. They've been through all the way through the letters of the alphabet. So, that's been an interesting thing to watch. Now, I talked a little about Pivotal. Pivotal was a company, was again, sort of an interesting thing. You had VMware making lots of money. You had EMC, its parent company, making lots of money. They were managing infrastructure. But at the same time, the industry was sort of watching as this new phenomenon had taken off, which was, let's build new types of applications, right? Let's build applications that are more distributed, that we can build faster. By 2009, the word DevOps was starting to float around in our vocabulary. And essentially it was, hey, if you want to build more modern applications, things that can take advantage of new technologies, new resources like the cloud, you have to stop having these silos, as Gartner had talked about, and you need to start sort of merging your teams together. And so we started to see, kind of for the first time, big money being invested around not just kind of the core technologies, but a lot of stuff to make that happen. And Pivotal was kind of the poster child for that. Pivotal was an interesting thing. It was an investment from VMware. It was an investment from GE, General Electric, because General Electric was going to revolutionize all of their industrial business through software. And then obviously it was an investment from like EMC as well. So EMC and VMware trying to basically say, hey, let's capture, we've captured infrastructure. Let's capture these modern applications. Let's not only have technology, but let's have sort of culture and teach you how to do these things. But you also had industry companies like GE and others investing in this space, saying, hey, this is going to be revolutionary to our business. So this was really the beginning of a lot of phrases that were starting to come along. The first one was, every company is going to be a software company, right? So the idea, GE was a perfect example. We're not really in the airplane engine businesses. We're in the airplane engine data businesses and maintaining and monitoring those systems. We're not in the electrical grid system business. We're in the data of electrical production and delivery, right? So you started to hear kind of all these notions that every company was a software company. You weren't a tractor company. You were a data for farmers that was delivered through a tractor company. You weren't a automobile company. You were in the lifecycle management of transportation. So Pivotal was sort of the first company that was really out there kind of pushing this mantra that every company is a software company. Yes, Mark Andreessen had already done his famous thing of software's eating the world. But this was the first time that you were really getting companies that I think if you had asked them a year or two before, would have said, hey, we're a physical goods company. We're in the automotive business, or we're in the pharmaceutical business, or we're in the oil and gas business. And they all of a sudden started going, ooh, if we were in the software business, we could really accelerate the things that could potentially, differentiate what we do. So there was a lot of talk around modern application building, cloud native applications, microservices. Big data was a big deal around this space. So whether it was like Hadoop or data lakes or data warehouses, this all sort of took off in that 2013, 2014 timeframe. We also started having every CIO and CEO going to conferences, whether it was reInvent, which started in 2013, or others coming back from those conferences, going to their teams and saying, I have seen the light, I have seen the future, I know where we're going. We are going to have a cloud-first strategy. And so every single IT department, whether they knew what a cloud-first strategy meant or not, was sort of tasked with, let's figure out how we modernize what we do. How do we turn our company into a software company? How do we make sure that every new deployment that we have is cloud first? Let's try and build every new application as a microservice. Let's start having two pizza teams. Size of our teams be two pizza teams. If they build it, they will run it. So a lot of the mantras that were coming out of the DevOps community, out of AWS, out of places like Pivotal, out of others, were starting to seep into the mainstream for every single company. So by 2014, 15, 16, that was the mantra that was going on. But again, sort of like when we had everybody saying we are going to be a retailer or an e-commerce company in 1999 or whatever, it was a lot of hype without necessarily the infrastructure in place to do it. And so this is where two things kind of came along. The first was infrastructure all of a sudden kind of started to follow this. So we quickly saw 2013, 2014, then 2015, 2016, Docker came along. So the idea of containers came along. So how do we help developers have consistent ways to build their applications and package their applications? Kubernetes comes along, and you have this whole industry-wide phenomenon of how can we quickly take commonly packaged applications, take the patterns that they need in terms of being able to find other services, communicate to them, and then deploy them in a way that is going to be highly robust, highly programmatic, and highly adaptable, and can run on any cloud environment. So all of a sudden, we were starting to get the matching of, I want these applications to be built differently. I want them to be changeable and adaptable more frequently, but I need the infrastructure that keeps up with that to sort of be available. And so this is when we start to see the shift from not only sort of VMs to containers, but we also begin to see this shift in adoption of Kubernetes as additional kind of cloud native capability. And what was interesting about this time was a whole bunch of things came out around this 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 timeframe, in which technologies that had been previously used within the cloud providers. So whether it was a Kubernetes at Google, or like Kafka being used inside of LinkedIn, or things coming out of Twitter, or things coming out of Uber and other places, these technologies were beginning to be open sourced by the teams who had built them internally at these companies. They were seeing huge opportunity because VC funding was flowing, not like a spigot, but like a river with all this cheap money. And so they were saying, hey, why don't I take these systems that we've built internally for infrastructure, for high availability, for data management, for big data, data science, AI, and start to make all these things open source, and we will create a company around them and be VC funded and so forth. So the latter part of the last 7-8 years, we saw tons and tons of VC money at super low rates. We saw more announcements about unicorns and decacorns and so forth than we've ever seen before. And again, all driven by cheap money. Now, keep in mind, all these companies are based on the same general principles that a Red Hat has had forever, or others, in which people have said, well, how are you going to make money giving away your software for free, right? How are you going to make money on open source? So we have an interesting thing going on. We have the cloud providers doing extremely well throughout this time. Just to put it in perspective, AWS up through about 2011, so they launched in 2006, up through 2011, nobody is really sure how much money they're making. They talk about growing a lot, but we're not sure how much money they're making. By 2011, they announced that they've made their first $1 billion in revenue. And by 2017, they announced that on about $4 or $5 or $6 billion of revenue, they've done $1 billion in profit. So it takes them a while to grow. But once that flywheel gets going, they start to grow like crazy, right? And obviously, we're exiting the decade at about a $60 or $70 billion company. They're now well north of $80 billion at very, very high profit margins. So the cloud provider flywheel takes off, at least to a certain extent. Now, the other cloud providers kind of go through some things. So Diane Green, what can I find my notes here? Google hired Diane Green, Diane Green took over as CEO of Google Cloud around 2013. So 2012, 2013. By 2015, she's out. She had previously been the founder of VMware, had run VMware. She had gone over to Google Cloud after some other things, but she's out by 2015. Google Cloud's kind of going nowhere at this point, doesn't have great leadership, isn't making any money, and to the point where some of the Google leaders are starting to say, well, if within 5 or 6 years, if by the end of the decade, we're not the second largest cloud, or maybe even the third largest cloud, we may get out of this business. This might be a business we want to get out of. So by 2018, they bring in Thomas Kurian, ex-Oracle CEO, or not CEO, but sort of president of Oracle. He comes in to try and totally reshape Google, basically, get it to be able to sell to the enterprise, because they're watching Microsoft and they're watching AWS just dominate this space. And Google's sitting there going, we kind of invented cloud computing with things like maps and search and other stuff, but yet we're losing in the IT part of cloud computing. So from 2018 till 2023, Google goes through massive, massive amounts of change. Microsoft, on the other hand, they had launched Windows Azure, They eventually change it to Azure because they start adopting things outside of that, outside of Windows. By 2014, Steve Ballmer, who had been around Microsoft forever, is out. They bring in somebody who most people really had never heard of, a gentleman named Satya Nadella, who had been, a big executive at Microsoft, but Microsoft had been so dominated by Gates and Ballmer for so long that a new face comes on the scene. He basically comes along and says, we're gonna kind of reverse all the things that Steve Ballmer tried to do in terms of being in the phone space, being in the device space, a whole bunch of things. And he really doubles down on saying, look, we need to be a company that competes in the modern world. And so they embrace all sorts of non-Windows technologies. They double down on cloud. He doubles down on a number of things. He starts to buy a number of SaaS things. He buys LinkedIn. He buys, they roll out they buy Skype. They buy a service that eventually becomes Teams. And people can have different opinions on if they like those tools or not. But those become the foundation of that plus Office 365. So they start to sort of continue to hedge on their dominance in the sort of business collaboration space and workspace. Then they start to do some interesting things. By 2018, they buy GitHub. So they basically double down that developers are really, really important. Huge GitHub acquisition, $8 billion at the time seemed enormous. And Microsoft has basically been the number 2 cloud for most of the decade. We're not exactly sure how much they're making. We have a guess, but our guess is they're about half as big as AWS by the end of the decade. And then, as we know, and we'll get into some shows later in the year, they basically double down on their partnership with OpenAI, which for a number of years looked really good. We'll see what the latest news and some of the changes at OpenAI pan out to be. But Microsoft is that one unique company that has survived the 70s, 80s. They've survived the desktop period. They've survived the internet browser period. They've survived cloud computing. And going into the AI period, they look like they are in very, very good position. So, leadership is a big deal. We start to see that at the cloud providers. A couple of other things that happen by, what time is it? 2016, Dell comes along and they decide they're going to do a huge, huge levered buyout of EMC, VMware, and Pivotal. So those 3 companies, EMC, VMware, and Pivotal, are rocking and rolling. They're doing extremely well. They're starting to look like they have kind of the dominant kind of combination of enterprise IT for infrastructure. They've got interesting things going on from an application perspective. They're kind of straddling the line of open source and proprietary. They're starting to, kind of gain the respect of developers and the interest of developers. And they're kind of looking like a very interesting, alternative to AWS at this time. And again, 2016, neither Azure or Google have really, really made a big run on AWS at this time. So Dell kind of comes from out of nowhere, completely unexpected, does a huge levered buyout of VMware, EMC, and Pivotal for $67 billion, one of the largest acquisitions of all time. And this really begins to reshape. So again, we're seeing consolidation happen on the non-cloud side of things. So people are basically saying, the bet that Michael Dell makes is we have to be big to be able to compete with these, super giant hyperscalers. And that's the bet he makes. And that, he's going to be kind of the one-stop shop for everything that's probably not going to be cloud. And, at the time, it seemed like an interesting bet. As we've fast forwarded and we've seen what happened eventually with VMware and then acquisition by Broadcom, that bet has proved to be really, really good for Michael Dell. It didn't necessarily turn into the super, powerhouse that it was expected to be, but, it'll be an interesting area to kind of follow going forward. And we'll dive into that, year-end show and into 2024 shows. A couple of other things. A lot of open source, I mentioned, had come out during this time. And we continue to see open source grow. The one thing that open source figures out is they still haven't quite figured out like a battle-tested, proven business model. There's a few different ways people are doing it. There's a number of ways people don't do it well, but they do begin to figure out a governance model. So by 2016, the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, comes along. Kubernetes is the first project in there. But since then, there are literally hundreds of projects that are, trying to get into that community, use that marketing leverage, be part of events like KubeCon and Cloud Native Con and others. I think the thing that they've done very well is essentially establish that Open source can define standards for technology. You can generally trust that those standards are going to be well governed. We're seeing communities formed around lots of companies and lots of individuals contributing to projects. And so the communities themselves are fairly robust. The companies trying to monetize them, some cases they are, some cases they're not. So that takes us through most of, as we get towards the end of the 2000 teens, if you will, we've got one cloud provider that's dominating. We've got a second cloud provider in Microsoft that's beginning to make a push, beginning to make a move on things, has made some very good strategic moves to start to catch up and to be well positioned. You've got a third cloud provider who is still struggling. I mean, not until this last year did Google turn a profit on Google Cloud. So they're still struggling, but they're making some progress, but still struggling in general. And then we get towards the end of the 20 teens, and we begin to see this other phenomenon starting to happen, which is crypto. And this is the thing where you kind of go, okay, what sort of history do we have repeating themselves? Well, we have lots of cheap money, we have kind of fraud, and we have criminality. And I'm not going to, make a statement that all crypto is fraud and criminal and so forth, but we do begin to have some very, very high profile, the beginnings of things that will eventually become very, very high profile, scams, Ponzi schemes, frauds, and so on and so forth. Just like at the end of the .com boom, we had some. At the end of the housing boom, we had people like Bernie Madoff, being the king of the Ponzi people. So there's always some at the end of any cycle. And anytime you start to see the fraud and the ridiculous valuations pop up, you kind of have a sense, okay, the bubble's starting to get towards the end. So anyways, been going for a while. What did we learn from all this? What were some of the lessons that we learned? Well, or where did we end up at this before COVID kicked in? Well, by the end of, by 2020, pre-COVID, cloud was pretty mainstream, right? We basically saw every startup was using cloud. Every enterprise organization or mid-sized organization was using cloud in one way, shape, or form. Many cases, they were using SaaS services, which had exploded, many of them running on AWS or others. But every IT organization was at least experimenting with it. Every IT organization had gone through at least one, maybe two, maybe three cycles of trying to figure out how to make things cloud first, how to make things cloud native first. Some cases, they tried to build them internally with their current IT teams. Other cases, they had, spun out teams to be the cloud team, to be the DevOps team. And they had, various levels of success. I don't know that I'd call it, widespread, consistent success everywhere, but we've seen pockets of success and pockets of failure, and maybe the second time around more success than the first time around. So we've seen that happen. Open source has gone through a tremendous explosion. As I mentioned, by 2010, we were starting to see people expand out into other areas. We were starting to see technology that had been proven within the bigger cloud start to become open source. Governance was in place. Lots and lots of VC funding was helping to drive this. Now, what's going to be interesting is, open source has been going through some bumps over the last few years, more in the post 2020 years, whether that's different licensing happening, changing licensing happening, things that are there to essentially protect some of these projects and some of the companies that are starting them. So it'll be very, very interesting to see, as interest rates have gone up, as funding is no longer at 0% interest rates, will VCs continue to fund open source the way they did over the last decade? Will we see the valuations that are going to drive people to be interested in this? Will we continue to see cloud providers and internet companies allowing companies, people to just leave with what was essentially their intellectual property to take it out to start companies? So I think open source is going to go through an interesting next decade of figuring out who's going to fund the early work, where the idea is going to come from. Will there be monetization that is more robust than we've seen today? Or are people going to kind of drift back to some level of proprietariness? So that's going to be a very, very interesting trend to watch. We saw a lot about, how the economics impact stuff, right? We've seen during good times, really interesting things happen. during tougher times, kind of crazy things happen, crazy valuations, fraud. We're now going through a period where people are starting to slow down a little bit, but yet there's always a thing on the horizon, a hope on the horizon. In this case, maybe it'll be AI, maybe it'll be something else that's pushing things. But we've definitely seen, the economics of stuff change stuff. Whether it's the economics of the cost of mobile phones, the cost of mobile bandwidth, the cost of open source being readily available to help, drive things at scale. All that kind of stuff has had a huge impact over the last decade. And then I think the last thing that I'll highlight as far as, sort of lessons learned is we have a tendency at any given point in time to, kind of want to pick winners and losers, right? Figure out a scoreboard, or, as my friend Dave Vellante says, like to kind of map out the horse race. Who's in the lead? How far ahead are they? And then we have a tendency to believe that, once somebody gets ahead, that they're never going to falter. They're never going to, they have a moat that's too big to change, and so forth. And I think what we've seen over the last few years across some of the biggest companies is that, even the biggest companies who seem untouchable, unfazable, can't make any mistakes, are going through their learning curves. They're going through their growing pains. Now they're doing it at larger scale than we've necessarily seen other places in the past, right? But if we take any of the big companies, the FANG companies, or any of the other sort of biggest companies, Amazon has gone through leadership changes. They've struggled somewhat post pandemic. AWS has struggled with new leadership in place. Now they've continued to grow, but the leadership under Jeff Bezos and the growth that they had is different than so far with Andy Jassy. AWS has been different under Andy Jassy than with Adam Selipsky. Now, are those short-term things? Maybe. But it does go to show that, anytime you have major leadership changes, you're going to have changes in the company, right? It's just hard to replicate leaders. At the end of the day, the people who sit in the big chair that ultimately make the big decision. Culture is great, but having a once in a lifetime leader is oftentimes it's like having the best quarterback. Every team in football has a quarterback, but when you have a generational quarterback, you are just primed to be so much better than everybody else, right? Google, we've mentioned, Google has been going through some things. They canceled a lot of projects. They were doing all sorts of moonshots. A lot of those things have been changed. We've seen them go through various types of antitrust type of regulation. I think a number of these companies are going to start to go through some of that. That impacts the trajectory of what they do. It impacts how well they're doing. Now, are they still doing extremely well? Are they still making tons of money? Yes, absolutely. But, are they perceived to be as completely untouchable as they were 3, 4, 6, 7 years ago? No, not necessarily, right? We look at Microsoft. Microsoft looked like, they were going to be the number 2 cloud provider. They weren't going to catch up to AWS. The last year or two, some of the AI investments they've made around OpenAI, some of the things they've been doing around GitHub, they look to be incredibly well positioned. And then, the actions of 2 weeks ago with what happened with OpenAI makes them look like, maybe they're a little more vulnerable than we thought they were with AI. Maybe they weren't thinking through all the scenarios far enough. So, kind of interesting times. Satya Nadella is coming up on 10 years as CEO. That's a very, very long time for anybody to be CEO. So they may be looking for some sort of transition in the next 3 to 5 years, depending on how long he wants to be there, or how long he has the motivation to do it. We look at Netflix. Netflix was the top of the world. They were dominating Hollywood. They were dominating media. They were dominating streaming. They were everything. Continued to take off during the pandemic. And then, they overinvested. They were paying way too much for projects. They were overpaying, 10 times overpaying, 5 times overpaying for projects. Other competition came along. They weren't the only company in that 10-year period that was doing streaming. And all of a sudden, Netflix is back to being an interesting company, but, a company that's having to change its business model from, just subscriptions to adding ads. People are questioning whether or not they have as many hits as they have. They can get themselves into challenging situations when things like the actors' strike happens and they don't have access to the materials to create. They don't have the library that a Disney does, or an HBO, or somebody, Paramount or Fox or somebody has. So they're all vulnerable in one way or the other. And then even we look at the latest superstar in the thing with OpenAI. People were like, OpenAI looks amazing. They're going to do an $80 billion valuation after 4 months ago being a $40 billion valuation. ChatGPT has taken over the world. And then over the weekend, they almost literally, light themselves on fire and blow their whole company up. So, it just sort of reminds you that these companies and the trends that we see can happen. Moats can happen. Big things can happen. But at the same time, one or two small changes, competition comes into the market, leadership at the top changes, the regulatory environment changes a little bit. And these companies can, they sort of live on a razor's edge. And so anyways, with that, I hope this session sort of gave you a sense of how long does it take from the beginning of an idea like DevOps or microservices to when it sort of becomes mainstream. Sometimes it can be 5 years, 10 years. So don't necessarily get frustrated if you feel like the thing you're working on isn't moving fast enough. We saw companies go through 1 iteration, 2, 3 iterations of trying to be cloud native. Failure happens, right? We're in a world in which, a lot of things we're doing sound very interesting, but they're going to take adaptation to get to where we're good at it. And so those things are going to happen. Technology doesn't always take off immediately. Sometimes it takes 3 years. Sometimes it takes 5 years. Sometimes it never happens, right? Sometimes you just need to be a little bit lucky, and something else happens outside of your control that changes the playing field, allows you to be successful all of a sudden. So all those things, it's been a really interesting decade. Obviously, we've tried to cover it as best we can on this show. We've been all over the place, obviously trying to cover it. But I hope this was helpful. I hope it gave you some sense of, between the 3 shows, if you go back and sort of listen to them all back to back, I think it should give you a good sense of how did we get from phase 0 to the end of, from beginning of phase 0 or phase 1 to the end of phase 1, what happened and what led into phase 2, what happened in good and bad and led into phase 3. And, as we go into sort of the 4th phase here, kind of COVID and the next decade or so, what's going to happen? And none of us have necessarily a crystal ball. We can look at, how open source is evolving. We can look at how chips are evolving. We can look at how networks are evolving. We can look at how the economy is evolving. And you can make predictions on all those types of things, and those are useful. I also think it's useful to look at, how trends have happened over the last couple of decades, because in many cases, the trends have repeated themselves. The leaders have bounced around between different companies, and they're going to take their experience and they're going to kind of share it with other people. And so we're going to see shared experience and shared repetitions and shared patterns and so forth. But I think the next phase is going to be really interesting. Will we see AI be as dominant as it is? Will AI figure out a viable business model? Will we still be living with a business model that is, very advertising centric? Or, will open source still be as prevalent in the 2020s as it was in the 2010s? Or will people move back to more proprietary software? Does open source get driven more by SaaS than anything else? So lots of really big things happening. What will the next generation come up with? What will be the working trends? What will be the working results of, work from home? Do we return to work? Do we not return back to work? All those sort of things, distribution of teams, distribution of revenue, economic trends, all those things are going to have a major factor in what happens in 2020. And some of it will repeat itself. Some of it will be brand new. And if you listen to any of these shows, you'll realize that if you sat there at the beginning of any of those phases and you tried to predict the last phase 7 years later, 10 years later, you probably would have got a lot of it wrong. You probably wouldn't even have known those things were possible. So, as you're thinking about these things, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of unpredictability. And sometimes things, the timing of things is really unique. So anyways, with that, I've been going for a long time. Obviously you can hear my voice is getting a little bit hoarse. Hope these have been interesting. Won't probably do any more history ones for a while. We got a lot of interesting things, as I mentioned, coming up to finish out the year. Hope you'll enjoy all of those. But enjoy December, last month of the year. Enjoy time with your family. Enjoy the holidays. Enjoy the lights. Enjoy the sounds and food and all those sort of things. And we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.